Section 14, A Pipe of Mystery, of Among Malay Pirates and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. A Pipe of Mystery by G. A. Henty. A jovial party were gathered round a blazing fire in an old grange near Warwick. The hour was getting late. The very little ones had, after dancing round the Christmas tree, enjoyed the snapdragon, and playing a variety of games, gone off to bed; and the elder boys and girls now gathered round their uncle, Colonel Harley, and asked him for a story, above all, a ghost story. "Well, I have never seen any ghosts," the Colonel said, laughing, "and, moreover, I don't believe in them one bit. I've travelled pretty well all over the world. I've slept in houses said to be haunted, but nothing have I seen. No noises that could not be accounted for by rats or the wind have I ever heard. I have never," and here he paused, "never but once met with any circumstances or occurrence that could not be accounted for by the light of reason, and I know you prefer hearing stories of my own adventures to mere invention." "Yes, uncle, but what was the once when circumstances happened that you could not explain?" "Well, it's rather a long story," the Colonel said, "and it's getting late." "Oh, no, no, uncle, it does not matter a bit how late we sit up on Christmas Eve, and the longer the story is the better. And if you don't believe in ghosts, how can it be a story of something you could not account for by the light of nature?" "Well, you will see when I have done," the Colonel said. "It's rather a story of what the Scotch call second sight than one of ghosts. As to accounting for it, you shall form your own opinion when you have heard me to the end. I landed in India in '50, after going through the regular drill work, marched with a detachment up country to join my regiment, which was stationed at Jubbulpore, in the very heart of India. It's become an important place since. The railroad across India passes through it, and no end of changes have taken place, but at that time it was one of the most out-of-the-way stations in India, and, I may say, one of the most pleasant. It lay high, there was capital boating on the Nebrudda, and, above all, it was a grand place for sport, for it lay at the foot of the hill country, an immense district, then but little known, covered with forest and jungle, and abounding with big game of all kinds. My great friend there was a man named Simmons. He was just of my own standing. We'd come out in the same ship, had marched up the country together, and were almost like brothers. He was an old Etonian, I am an old Westminster, and we were both fond of boating, and indeed of sports of all kinds. But I'm not going to tell you of that now. The people in these hills are called Gonds, a true hill tribe, that is to say, aborigines, somewhat of the negro type. The chiefs are of mixed blood, but the people are almost black. They are supposed to accept the religion of the Hindoos, but are in reality deplorably ignorant and superstitious. Their priests are a sort of compound of a Brahmin priest and a negro fetish man, and among their principal duties is that of charming away tigers from the villages by means of incantations. There, as in other parts of India, were a few wandering fakirs who enjoyed an immense reputation for holiness and wisdom. The people would go to them from great distances for charms or predictions, and believed in their power with implicit faith. At the time when we were in Jubbulpore, there was one of these fellows whose reputation altogether eclipsed that of his rivals, and nothing could be done until his permission had been asked and his blessing obtained. All sorts of marvellous stories were constantly coming to our ears of the unerring foresight with which he predicted the termination of diseases, both in men and animals, and so generally was he believed in that the colonel ordered that no one connected with the regiment should consult him, for these predictions very frequently brought about their own fulfilment. For those who were told that an illness would terminate fatally lost all hope, and literally lay down to die. However, many of the stories that we heard could not be explained on these grounds, and the fakir and his doings were often talked over at mess, some of the officers scoffing at the whole business, others maintaining that some of these fakirs had, in some way or another, the power of foretelling the future, citing many well authenticated anecdotes upon the subject. The older officers were the believers, we young fellows were the scoffers, but for the well known fact that it's very seldom indeed that these fakirs will utter any of their predictions to Europeans, some of us would have gone to him to test his powers. As it was, none of us had ever seen him. He lived in an old ruined temple in the middle of a large patch of jungle at the foot of the hills, some 10 or 12 miles away. I had been at Jubbulpore about a year when I was woke up one night by a native who came in to say that at about 8 o'clock a tiger had killed a man in his village and had dragged off the body. Simmons and I were constantly out after tigers, and the people in all the villages within 20 miles knew that we were always ready to pay for early information. This tiger had been doing great damage, and had carried off about 30 men, women, and children. So great was the fear of him, indeed, that the people in the neighbourhood he frequented scarcely dared stir out of doors, except in parties of 5 or 6. We had had several hunts after him, but, like all man-eaters, he was old and awfully crafty, and although we got several snap shots at him, he had always managed to save his skin. In a quarter of an hour after the receipt of the message, Charley Simmons and I were on the back of an elephant, which was our joint property. A shikari, a capital fellow, was on foot beside us, and with the native trotting on ahead as guide, we went off at the best pace of old Begum, for that was the elephant's name. The village was 15 miles away, but we got there soon after daybreak, and were received with delight by the population. In half an hour the hunt was organized. All male population turned out as beaters, with sticks, guns, tom-toms, and other instruments for making a noise. The trail was not difficult to find. A broad path, with occasional smears of blood, showed where the tiger had dragged his victim through the long grass to a cluster of trees a couple of 100 yards from the village. We scarcely expected to find him there, but the villagers held back while we went forward with cocked rifles. We found, however, nothing but a few bones and a quantity of blood. The tiger had made off at the approach of daylight into the jungle, which was about 2 miles distant. We traced him easily enough, and found that he had entered a large ravine, from which several smaller ones branched off. It was an awkward place, as it was next to impossible to surround it with the number of people at our command. We posted them at last all along the upper ground, and told them to make up in noise what they wanted in numbers. At last all was ready, and we gave the signal. However, I am not telling you a hunting story, and need only say that we could neither find nor disturb him. In vain we pushed Begum through the thickest of the jungle, which clothed the sides and bottom of the ravine, while the men shouted, beat their tom-toms, and showered imprecations against the tiger himself and his ancestors up to the remotest generations. The day was tremendously hot, and after 3 hours' march we gave it up for a time and lay down in the shade, while the shikaris made a long examination of the ground all round the hillside, to be sure that the tiger had not left the ravine. They came back with the news that no traces could be discovered, and that, beyond a doubt, he was still there. A tiger will crouch up in an exceedingly small clump of grass or bush, and will sometimes almost allow himself to be trodden on before moving. However, we determined to have one more search, and if that should prove unsuccessful, to send off to Jubbulpore for some more of the men to come out with elephants, while we kept up a circle of fires and of noises of all descriptions, so as to keep him a prisoner until the arrival of the reinforcements. Our next search was no more successful than our first had been, and having, as we imagined, examined every clump and crevice in which he could have been concealed, we had just reached the upper end of the ravine when we heard a tremendous roar, followed by a perfect babel of yells and screams from the natives. The outburst came from the mouth of the ravine, and we felt at once that he had escaped. We hurried back to find, as we had expected, that the tiger was gone. He had burst out suddenly from his hiding place, had seized a native, torn him horribly, and had made across the open plain. Now this was terribly provoking, but we had nothing to do but follow him. This was easy enough, and we traced him to a detached patch of wood and jungle 2 miles distant. This wood was 400 or 500 yards across, and the exclamations of the people at once told us that it was the one in which stood the ruined temple of the fakir of whom I had been telling you. I forgot to say that as the tiger broke out, one of the village shikaris had fired, and, he declared, wounded the tiger. It was already getting late in the afternoon, and it was hopeless to attempt to beat the jungle that night. We therefore sent off a runner with a note to the colonel, asking him to send the work elephants, and to allow a party of volunteers to march over at night, to help surround the jungle when we commenced beating it in the morning.